The moment Gwen Hollister's lips curled into that victorious smirk and she uttered those 7 words, I knew my entire world had just shifted. We don't need your foreign connections anymore. Standing there in her corner office on the 42nd floor, watching her erase 18 months of my life's work with 3 brisk keystrokes, I felt something fracture inside me that I hadn't experienced since I was 17. The same empty ache that hit the morning I discovered my father slumped over his kitchen table, surrounded by rejection letters and foreclosure notices. His heart had finally given out from the pressure of losing everything to corporate predators just like her. She didn't even glance up from her screen as she wiped out contract after contract. Ako Tanaka from Osaka, the Petrova family in Bulgaria, Miguel Santos in Mexico City. People who had relied on me, who had shaped their companies around our agreements, who were probably right now preparing shipments they'd never see a cent for. Honestly, I don't even know why Harrison brought you on in the first place, Gwen went on, her fingers gliding over the keyboard like she was performing a melody. All this relationship-building nonsense. We're a company, not a charity for immigrant sob stories. Before I go any further into what happened next, could you take a moment to tell me in the comments where you're listening from? Because I want to know where my story is reaching across the world. And please like, subscribe, and hit the bell notification, because what I'm about to reveal changed everything. Not just for me, but for everyone who believed powerful people could ruin lives without repercussions. My name is Claire, and there's something you need to understand about Gwen Hollister before we continue. She wasn't just any executive. She was the kind of woman who had constructed her entire career on the rubble of other people's shattered ambitions. 23 years at Morrison Industrial, rising from junior analyst to vice president of global procurement, leaving a trail of damaged careers behind her like breadcrumbs. But here's what she never knew about me, what no one at Morrison ever knew about me. 15 years ago, when I was a freshman at State, my father worked for a small consulting firm that Gwen's previous company acquired. Dad was 58, had been with his firm for 16 years, spoke 3 languages fluently, and had cultivated relationships across Europe that generated 60% of their international revenue. Gwen dismantled him over 6 months, not with one explosive confrontation, but with the slow venom of professional degradation. She challenged his reports in meetings, reassigned his clients to younger employees, spread whispers about his cognitive abilities, made him rewrite proposals 5, 6, 7 times for reasons that shifted daily. She turned his own team against him by insinuating he was stunting the company's growth. My father, who had survived immigrating to this country with nothing, who had built a reputation rooted in integrity and trust, who had never missed a single day of work in his entire career, began having panic attacks in the office parking lot. He would sit in his car for 20 minutes every morning trying to summon the courage to walk inside and face another round of psychological warfare. The morning I found him at that kitchen table, surrounded by termination documents and medical bills he couldn't pay, was the morning I vowed that someday, somehow, I would understand people like Gwen Hollister. I would learn how they functioned, how they reasoned, how they excused destroying human beings for profit margins and personal ambition. I studied business, specialized in international supply chain management, and spent 7 years working for smaller firms, mastering every facet of global procurement. Not because I adored the work, but because I was shaping myself into exactly the kind of person who could get close to someone like Gwen. When the opening at Morrison appeared, when I saw Gwen's name listed as the hiring manager, I knew the universe was handing me an opportunity I couldn't afford to ignore. But I also knew simple revenge wouldn't suffice. It needed to be poetic. It needed to teach her something about consequences. It needed to make her feel the same powerlessness my father endured in those final months. So I accepted the job, and I became exactly what Gwen required me to be: enthusiastic, diligent, thankful for the chance. Someone who asked just enough questions to seem involved, but never enough to appear threatening. Someone who could travel endlessly without complaint, who could handle difficult international partners, who could fix problems that more senior staff couldn't manage. For 18 months, I nurtured relationships that Morrison had never imagined possible. Not just with suppliers, but with their families, their communities, their histories. I learned that Ako Tanaka's grandfather had been forced to sell his textile shop after the war, and she was trying to rebuild what her family had lost. I discovered the Petrova family had launched their packaging company after escaping political persecution, using their grandmother's life savings as collateral. Miguel Santos had 3 daughters, all studying engineering, all dreaming of expanding their family's precision tooling business into aerospace components. Every single connection I formed was with people who reminded me of my father. People who had spent their whole lives creating something meaningful, something built to endure beyond themselves. But I wasn't cultivating these relationships for Morrison's gain. I was building them for something far greater. You see, while I was traveling, negotiating, and solving supply chain challenges, I was also researching Gwen's career history. Every company she had worked for, every acquisition she had managed, every restructuring she had overseen. And what I discovered was a pattern that made my stomach twist with recognition. 15 years ago, it wasn't just my father. There was Linda Chen, a translator who had helped Gwen's team navigate contracts in Taiwan. Gwen fired her 3 days before Christmas, citing budget cuts, then hired her replacement at twice the salary, and Linda's family lost their home. There was Roberto Vega, who had managed relationships with Mexican manufacturers for 8 years. Gwen eliminated his position, took credit for his work, and used his contacts to negotiate deals that saved the company millions. Roberto ended up driving for a delivery service, trying to support his wife's cancer treatments without health insurance. There was Elena Kowalski, whose small Polish firm supplied specialty components for automotive clients. Gwen persuaded the parent company to demand impossible contract terms, forcing Elena into bankruptcy, then swooped in to acquire her equipment and client list for pennies. The pattern was always the same: identify vulnerable people doing essential work, systematically undermine them, take everything they'd built, and move on without looking back. Gwen had built her entire career on the ruins of small business owners and immigrant workers who trusted the wrong person. So when I began reaching out to suppliers for Morrison, I wasn't just seeking the best deals or the most reliable partners. I was deliberately finding people whose stories mirrored the ones I had uncovered in Gwen's wake. People who had been broken by corporate predators, who had rebuilt from nothing, who knew what it felt like to have your life's work destroyed by someone who saw you as disposable. And I found them everywhere. Ako's textile company. Her father had been cheated by an American distributor in the 90s, losing contracts that nearly bankrupted the family. The Petrova packaging firm. They had been forced out of partnerships with Western companies who promised stability, only to have their designs disappear. Miguel's tooling business. His brother had been systematically excluded from contracts by procurement managers who favored larger, white-owned firms. Every supplier I brought to Morrison carried scars from people just like Gwen. And slowly, carefully, I began telling them stories. Not about my father specifically, but about the patterns I had observed, the way certain executives operated, the warning signs to watch for, and the importance of protecting yourself when dealing with corporate predators. I never mentioned Gwen's name. I never made any direct accusations. I had just shared observations about how powerful people sometimes treated partners they considered expendable, and how crucial it was to maintain leverage in relationships with companies that might not honor their commitments. By month 12, every supplier contract I negotiated included specific clauses about notification, periods, penalty structures, and coordinated withdrawal rights. Terms that seemed reasonable from Morrison's perspective, but would be devastating if triggered simultaneously. I framed these clauses as standard international protections, necessary when working with overseas partners who had been burned before. Gwen signed every contract without reading the fine print, trusting my expertise and focusing only on the cost savings I was delivering. Morrison's profit margins improved by 38% in my first year, largely because I had found suppliers willing to work for rates that barely covered their costs, hoping to build long-term relationships with an American company that appeared to value their contributions. By month 15, I had documentation of everything, not just the contracts and financial arrangements, but the personal stories behind each partnership. Video testimonials from supplier families about their hopes for the future, photos of their facilities, their workers, their communities, proof of how Morrison's business was literally supporting hundreds of families across 3 continents. I also had detailed reports on Gwen's decision-making patterns, her attitudes toward international partners, her casual dismissal of suppliers she considered beneath her notice, comments she had made about these people and their backwards business practices, and email chains where she mocked partners' English, even when they spoke 4 languages fluently. By month 18, the web was complete. Every critical component in Morrison's supply chain flowed through relationships I had built with people who had been destroyed by executives like Gwen, people who trusted me, who understood I saw them as human beings rather than profit centers, who knew I would never treat them the way corporate America had treated them before. And then came that Tuesday morning when Gwen decided she'd had enough of my relationship-building nonsense. I had been in her office for what I assumed was a routine quarterly review. Morrison had just announced record profits, driven largely by the international partnerships I had developed. I expected recognition, maybe even discussion of a promotion. Instead, Gwen pulled up her computer and began explaining how the company was shifting exclusively toward domestic suppliers. "These foreign contracts are too complicated," she said, scrolling through the list of partnerships I had spent months cultivating. "Too much hand-holding, too many cultural sensitivities to manage. We need suppliers who understand American business practices." I watched her cancel Akiko's textile contract, $2 million annually. Gone. The Petrova packaging deal, 18 months of negotiations, terminated. Miguel's precision components, essential for Morrison's aerospace division, were eliminated. "But Gwen," I said carefully, "these suppliers provide components we can't source domestically. The Petrova family produces packaging materials with specifications American manufacturers can't match. Miguel's tooling precision is beyond anything available in our price range here." She looked at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. "Claire, you're thinking like a relationship counselor instead of a business professional. We don't need their sob stories about family businesses and cultural traditions. We need products delivered on schedule at competitive prices. There are plenty of American suppliers who can provide what we need without all the emotional complexity." That phrase, emotional complexity, hit me like a physical blow. It was exactly the kind of language Gwen had used 15 years ago when describing my father's inefficient approach to client relationships, the same dismissive tone she had used while systematically destroying everyone who had ever trusted her judgment. I realized in that moment that Gwen hadn't learned a thing from decades of ruining lives. She hadn't gained empathy, wisdom, or even basic human decency. She was exactly the same person who had driven my father to his grave, only with better suits and a bigger office. "What about the penalty clauses?" I asked quietly. "The coordinated withdrawal provisions in these contracts?" Gwen waved her hand dismissively. "Legal will handle whatever paperwork needs to be filed. These people should be grateful they got 18 months of business from us. Most international suppliers never get opportunities like this." She finished canceling the last contract and turned to me with that triumphant smirk. "Honestly, Claire, I think this will be good for your professional development. You've gotten too emotionally invested in these partnerships. In this business, you can't afford to care about every supplier's personal story. Success requires focusing on results, not relationships. And then she said it. The 7 words that changed everything. We don't need your foreign connections anymore. I nodded slowly, thanked her for the feedback, and walked out of her office. But instead of returning to my desk, I went straight to the bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and started making phone calls. The first call was to Ako Tanaka in Osaka. It was 3 in the morning her time, but she answered on the second ring, probably thinking it was an emergency, which, in a way, it was. Ako, this is Claire from Morrison. I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, and then I need you to make some phone calls of your own. Within 6 hours, every single supplier I had partnered with over 18 months had received identical messages, not from me directly, but from each other. The network I had spent so long building wasn't just about business relationships, it was about shared experiences, mutual protection, and understanding exactly when to act together. Ako called the Petrova family in Bulgaria. The Provas reached out to Miguel in Mexico City. Miguel contacted the semiconductor manufacturers in Taiwan. The Taiwanese suppliers called the packaging companies in Vietnam, like dominoes falling in reverse. Each conversation triggered 3 more until suppliers across 12 countries were simultaneously reviewing their Morrison contracts and discovering something remarkable. Every single one of their agreements contained the same coordinated withdrawal clause I had carefully negotiated months earlier. The language seemed like standard legal protection, but in reality, it meant that if Morrison terminated any international supplier without cause, all remaining international suppliers had the right to withdraw immediately without penalty. By Thursday morning, Morrison's production floor was eerily silent. Not because of a strike or equipment failure, but because 68% of their critical components had simply stopped arriving. The precision tooling from Miguel's shop that kept their aerospace division running, the specialty polymers from Vietnam that made their automotive parts possible, the textile components from Akiko that were essential for defense contracts. I watched from my desk as operations managers began panicking around 10 a.m., making frantic phone calls to suppliers who politely explained they were exercising their contractual withdrawal rights. By noon, manufacturing supervisors were gathered in emergency meetings, trying to understand how Morrison had become so dependent on international suppliers they apparently no longer needed. Gwen spent Thursday afternoon in crisis mode, calling domestic suppliers who quoted prices 3 times higher than our international partners, with delivery timelines stretching into the next quarter. Companies that could maybe provide substitutes for some components, but had never heard of others. This is a temporary adjustment period, she announced to the operations team Friday morning, her voice carrying a hint of strain. We're transitioning to more reliable domestic partnerships that align with our strategic vision. But by Friday afternoon, Morrison's biggest client, a defense contractor expecting specialized components next week, called to express concerns about production delays, followed by the automotive company that relied on Morrison's precision, parts demanding answers about alternative suppliers. I spent the entire week documenting everything, not just the operational chaos, but Gwen's responses, her dismissive comments about suppliers, overreacting to normal business decisions, her insistence that international partners were inherently unreliable and Morrison was better off without them, her complete inability to grasp why terminating 68% of their supply chain simultaneously might cause problems. The real revelation came Monday morning when CEO Harrison called an emergency executive meeting. I wasn't supposed to be in that room, but Harrison had specifically requested my presence since I was the only person who fully understood Morrison's international supplier relationships. Gwen looked genuinely confused about why I was there, probably assuming I'd be blamed for the crisis rather than consulted for solutions. Harrison opened the meeting with a simple question. Can someone explain how we went from record profits to production shutdown in 4 days? Gwen launched into a polished presentation about supply chain diversification, strategic realignment, and the benefits of domestic sourcing, with slides showing cost projections and risk assessments, all meant to demonstrate why eliminating international suppliers was sound business strategy. The temporary disruption we're experiencing, she concluded confidently, is the natural consequence of transitioning away from an over-reliance on foreign partnerships that were ultimately unsustainable. Harrison listened patiently, then turned to me. Claire, you built these relationships. Help me understand what actually happened here. This was the moment I had been preparing for without fully realizing it for 18 months. I opened my laptop and pulled up the presentation I had been building since Tuesday, the one that told the real story of Morrison's international partnerships. Mr. Harrison, with your permission, I'd like to show you exactly who our international suppliers are and what our relationships with them actually meant. The first slide displayed Akiko Tanaka's textile facility in Osaka, not just production statistics, but photos of her family's workshop, her grandfather's original equipment, and the 3 generations of workers who had helped build components for Morrison's defense contracts. I explained how Akiko had restructured her entire operation around Morrison's specifications, hiring 12 additional workers and investing in new machinery specifically for our partnership. The second slide introduced the Petrova family. Elena Petrova's husband had lost his engineering job during Bulgaria's economic crisis, and their packaging company had been their family's path back to stability. Morrison's contracts had allowed them to expand into a new facility, providing employment for 43 people in their rural community. The third slide showed Miguel Santos and his precision tooling operation. I displayed photos of his 3 daughters, all studying engineering and hoping to join the family business that Morrison's aerospace contracts had made possible. Miguel had been working 16-hour days to meet Morrison's quality standards, building equipment that literally couldn't be sourced anywhere else at our price point. Slide after slide, I introduced Harrison to people Gwen had dismissed as foreign connections, showing facility tours, quality certifications, and testimonials from workers whose families depended on Morrison's business. I demonstrated how these weren't just vendor relationships, but partnerships with human beings who had bet their futures on Morrison's commitment. These suppliers aren't just providing components, I explained, watching Harrison's expression change as he absorbed the scope of what we'd lost. They're providing components that can't be replicated domestically. Akiko's textile process uses techniques her grandfather developed. The Petrova's packaging materials have chemical properties American manufacturers can't match. Miguel's tooling precision exists because he's been refining his processes for 20 years. Then I showed Harrison the financial impact, not just the immediate production delays, but the long-term consequences of losing supplier relationships that had taken decades to develop. The contracts we had voided represented partnerships worth $47 million annually, with suppliers who had been averaging 18% year-over-year growth in their work with Morrison. Mr. Harrison, I continued, these partnerships weren't expendable overhead. They were competitive advantages our domestic competitors don't have access to. We were paying lower prices for higher quality because these suppliers trusted Morrison enough to prioritize our contracts over potentially more profitable opportunities. I watched Gwen's face throughout my presentation, seeing her confusion gradually shift to concern as Harrison asked increasingly pointed questions. Why hadn't she consulted operations before canceling critical supplier relationships? Why hadn't she explored transition timelines instead of immediate terminations? Why hadn't she understood the coordinated withdrawal clauses before triggering them? But the moment that truly changed everything came when I showed Harrison the final section of my presentation. The documentation I had gathered about each supplier's previous experiences with American companies. the pattern of international partners being promised long-term relationships, delivering exceptional results, then being abandoned when companies decided to streamline operations. These suppliers had worked with Morrison despite having been burned before. I explained, because they believed we were different, because I spent 18 months proving that we valued their contributions and understood their worth. Harrison was silent for several minutes, studying the financial projections and supplier profiles, before finally looking at Gwen with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger, but deep disappointment. Gwen, help me understand the strategic thinking behind eliminating $47 million in annual revenue without consulting operations, finance, or the executive team. Gwen started explaining again about domestic sourcing and simplified logistics, but her confidence was clearly wavering. She kept using phrases like these people and cultural complications, language that sounded increasingly problematic in the context of my presentation. What cultural complications? Harrison asked. Claire's documentation suggests these suppliers were consistently exceeding quality standards and delivery requirements. Well, the language barriers, the time zone difficulties, the constant need for relationship management, Gwen replied, her voice tightening. International suppliers require so much hand-holding compared to domestic partners who understand American business practices. That's when Harrison asked the question that revealed everything. Gwen, have you reviewed the withdrawal clauses in these contracts? Silence. Long, uncomfortable silence, because according to my documentation, every international supplier had the contractual right to withdraw immediately if Morrison terminated other international suppliers without cause. Did you understand that canceling one contract would trigger coordinated withdrawal from all international partners? More silence. Gwen's face was paling as she realized Harrison wasn't asking rhetorical questions. Mr. Harrison, she said carefully, I trusted that legal had reviewed these contracts appropriately. The withdrawal clauses seemed like standard protective language. Standard protective language, Harrison repeated slowly. Gwen, these clauses exist specifically to prevent companies from treating international suppliers as expendable. They're designed to ensure partnerships are honored rather than eliminated on executive whims. I watched Gwen slowly grasp that she had walked into a trap of her own making, not because I had tricked her, but because her fundamental contempt for international partners had blinded her to the actual terms of relationships I had spent months negotiating. Claire, Harrison said, turning to me, in your assessment, is there any possibility of rebuilding these partnerships? This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment I could deliver the truth that would change everything for Gwen without revealing my personal motivations. Mr. Harrison, I spent Friday reaching out to our former suppliers to explore reconciliation possibilities. Unfortunately, the response has been consistent across all partners. They're willing to consider future relationships with Morrison, but only under one specific condition. What condition? They require written guarantee that Gwen Hollister will have no involvement in international supplier relationships going forward. The room went dead silent. Gwen stared at me as if I had slapped her. What? She whispered. I'm sorry, Gwen, but I have to be completely honest about their feedback. Multiple suppliers specifically mentioned feeling disrespected during previous interactions with you. They cited comments about their English skills, dismissive attitudes toward their business practices, and what they perceived as cultural insensitivity. I pulled up my laptop again, showing Harrison documented communications from our former partners, not recordings or private conversations, but formal written responses to my reconciliation inquiries. Ako Tanaka's letter was particularly damning. Ms. Hollister's approach to international partnerships demonstrates fundamental misunderstanding of mutual respect in business relationships. Her comments about foreign complications and simplified logistics suggest Morrison views international suppliers as problematic rather than valuable. Miguel Santos had been even more direct. We appreciate Claire's professionalism, but cannot risk future investments with company leadership that considers our contributions dispensable. Ms. Hollister's termination approach indicates systematic disregard for international partner commitments. One by one, I shared feedback from suppliers across 3 continents, all expressing similar concerns about Gwen's attitudes and decision-making, not angry rants or emotional complaints, but professional assessments of why they couldn't trust Morrison's leadership going forward. These aren't personal attacks, I explained to Harrison. They're business decisions based on demonstrated patterns of behavior. International suppliers can't afford to invest in partnerships with companies that might eliminate them arbitrarily. Harrison spent the next hour reviewing supplier documentation, contract terms, and financial projections, asking detailed questions about rebuilding possibilities, domestic sourcing alternatives, and operational timelines. Throughout the discussion, Gwen sat in increasingly uncomfortable silence as the scope of her miscalculation became clear. Finally, Harrison closed his laptop and looked directly at Gwen. "I need some time to review the situation with the board. Claire, can you provide me with comprehensive documentation of our international supplier relationships and the specific feedback you've received about rebuilding possibilities?" "Of course, Mr. Harrison." "Gwen, I'll need you to prepare a detailed report explaining the strategic reasoning behind these termination decisions and your assessment of domestic sourcing alternatives." After the meeting ended, Gwen cornered me by the elevator, her professional composure finally cracking. "Claire, what exactly did you tell these suppliers about me?" I looked at her with the same calm expression I'd maintained throughout the presentation. "I told them the truth, Gwen. I shared your exact words about not needing foreign connections anymore." She started, then stopped herself. "You didn't mean—" "What? That you don't value international partnerships? That cultural sensitivity is unnecessary? That relationship management is emotional complexity we can't afford?" She stared at me, probably realizing for the first time that her casual dismissal of international suppliers had been documented and shared with the very people she'd dismissed. "Those suppliers trusted Morrison because they trusted me," I continued. "When you terminated their contracts while calling their work foreign complications, you destroyed relationships that took 18 months to build." "They're not angry, Gwen. They're protecting themselves from exactly the kind of treatment you've given them." The elevator arrived, and I stepped inside. Just before the doors closed, I said the words I'd been waiting 15 years to deliver. Sometimes the people you consider dispensable turn out to be the ones holding everything together. 3 weeks later, Harrison announced that Morrison was restructuring its procurement division. Gwen Hollister would be transitioning to a customer service role where her domestic focus could be better utilized, while I was promoted to Director of Global Supplier Relations with full authority to rebuild the international partnerships Morrison had lost. It took 6 months to restore relationships with most of our former suppliers, not because they were vindictive, but because they needed proof that Morrison had learned from its mistakes. They required guarantees, oversight structures, and cultural sensitivity training for all executive staff involved in international partnerships. Gwen lasted 8 months in customer service before transferring to a smaller company. According to people who stayed in touch, she now handles complaint calls for a regional distribution center, dealing daily with frustrated customers ignored by corporate policies they can't control. I never told anyone about my father, never revealed the real reason I'd chosen Morrison, or why I'd spent 18 months building relationships with suppliers who reminded me of people Gwen had destroyed before. The revenge wasn't about exposing her past, it was about letting her experience the consequences of her own choices. Every supplier who withdrew did so because Gwen had treated them as expendable. Every partnership we lost was lost because she valued control over collaboration. Every financial consequence Morrison faced was the direct result of her decisions, her words, and her fundamental inability to see international partners as human beings worthy of respect. The most satisfying part wasn't watching Gwen lose her executive position or struggle in customer service. It was knowing she finally understood what my father had felt during those last 6 months of his life. The helplessness of watching everything you've built disappear because someone more powerful decided you were no longer valuable. If you've stayed with me through this story, if you understand why I spent 18 months planning something this complex, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to my channel, because there are more Gwen Hollisters out there, more executives who think human beings are expendable, and more stories about what happens when people underestimate the power of patience, planning, and the relationships we build with each other. The people who seem invisible to those in power, we see everything, and sometimes we remember longer than they think we do.